My genderqueer name is RBO, and it's the initials of my name that I chose in 1984, Rachel Bat Or. And I chose the initials as my genderqueer name because along the way, as I've been in different places, in different schools and different jobs, people end up calling me RBO, no matter where I go. And it feels like the perfect genderqueer name for me because it doesn't identify me the way Rachel does as a woman, and it gives me the option to feel as open as I do. My friends tell me that they see me as a miracle, as a trailblazer, as a badass, and as a pioneer. So the badass part is easy because I really don't take a lot of BS from people, and I have a pretty extensive BS detector, and if I think someone is telling me something that's really not true, depending upon how badass I feel at the time, I can either take it on directly and say that's BS, or use the actual words I'm using the letters for, or I can say, it seems to me like there's something else going on. But I really do confront people, and being a rabbi, people have started calling me the kick butt rabbi because of that. So kick butt is a nicer way to say badass, but I like badass. Pioneer is because when I was born in the middle 40s and came of age in the 50s and 60s, there was very clear definition of what it meant to be a woman and what it meant to be a man. And I, even at that time, did not fit in to either one. And I tried so hard to fit into being a woman. I wore the clothes that women were supposed to wear. I flirted and dated and did all those things that I watched women do. None of it ever felt natural to me. And it wasn't until I came out as a lesbian in 1976 that I even had any understanding of how I could be a woman and not fit into the norms that I was told I had to be. So I'm a pioneer in how I've lived my life, and lived my life by telling the truth to myself as soon as I knew it, and continued on to always question if I was being honest about myself, to myself. When I came out as a lesbian, I didn't just come out to myself and keep it to myself. That doesn't seem to be the path that I go on in this lifetime, that I did it out loud. I was working at the New Haven Women's Liberation Center as the director, so I had a job where being out was very important. And I talked about it and went on the radio and talked about it and went to college classrooms and talked about what it meant to be a lesbian. And one of the things that would always amuse me when I would talk in a college classroom is that the women would look at each other and say, I feel that way about my best friends. I can't talk to my husband about anything, but I tell my best friends everything. I wonder what that means. And I knew enough to not be a badass in that moment and say, duh, what do you think it means? But people would be sparked in their thinking by what I said. So, and my friends say that I'm a miracle because I've had a not so easy beginning to my life. And in order for me to become who I am, I had to face some of the things that happened to me and be able to overcome them. And there's a phrase in Hebrew, Nes Gadol Haya Po, a great miracle happened here. And that will be the title of my memoir when I write it. I was born September 4th, 1945, in Hartford, Connecticut. And it wasn't until later that I understood that I was born exactly 4 months after the war in Europe ended. And I say that because I don't remember not knowing about the Holocaust. It was a piece of what I was raised with. So even though my parents weren't religious, Jewishly, we didn't belong to a synagogue, I always knew that I was a Jew and that I wasn't safe in the world. Those two things were very clear. Both of my parents were immigrants. They came to the States in the early 1900s from the Ukraine. They both came from the same place. And they had been raised very religiously and rebelled against it because in America, that's not what you did. So they kept kosher only until my grandmother died, who'd been living with us. And then they just stopped keeping kosher because they thought that that was going to ruin their lives to be so tied to Jewish traditions and rituals. My father was a tool and die inspector and a clear union man, and a Democrat, as was my mother. And I was raised to be a Democrat because that's what you did when your parents were Democrats, you were too. And in school, I remember in school in 1952, when the election happened for president, which they could never do today, but they took a vote who you would vote for president. And because all of the Christian Catholic students went to a Catholic school, there was a majority Jews in the school, and every one of us raised our hands that we were Democrats. We would vote for Stevenson, and there were 2 or 3 people who would vote for Eisenhower. I think the other reason that there were so few Republicans is that we really lived in a very working class part of the city. And in particular, my parents lived in a housing project. And I didn't even know that was a thing until I became more political in my later life, and people talked about working class people living in the project. And I thought, I guess that's me. But before that, it was just that's how I was raised, that's where I lived. And I didn't know that I got this certain credence, I got this street cred because I was raised in the projects. So it was definitely a very working class environment. My mother was a stay-at-home mom until we couldn't afford to have her stay at home anymore. And my father always felt like he was a failure because my mother had to go to work to help support us. And because men did not send their wives to work in those days. I was raised very clearly to be a nice Jewish girl, marry a nice Jewish boy, and have nice Jewish children. Even though the household wasn't kosher, we observed holidays, sort of. It was definitely Judaism light. We lit candles for Hanukkah. We had a dinner for Rosh Hashanah. No one fasted on Yom Kippur. And we had a dinner for the Seder, but not really a Seder. So it was very frustrating to be told to do one thing and to be shown to do something else. But I bought into it. I bought into the whole thing. And I remember when I was 16 looking for a job in the newspaper. And it was a ritual that I would open up the paper and look to see what was available. And at the time, this was very early 60s, at the time there were 2 sections for jobs. There was job wanted male and job wanted female. And the female jobs were teacher, nurse, secretary, stewardess, clerk typist, cleaning lady, and then all the other kinds of nurse that wasn't really a nurse, but the ones that cleaned up after the nurses left, the doctors and the nurses and the cleaning people. And all the help wanted male were doctors, lawyers, engineers, business executives, all of the things that were the really interesting things to do. And I would keep looking at the help wanted male because I wanted to do those jobs. But I knew that if I applied for them, I'd be called a lessee. And of course, when I was 16, that was nowhere near anything that I was thinking about, and knew that that was a bad thing. So I had to choose from the jobs that seemed to me really boring. But those were my choices at the time.
How did you deal with this notion of, like, did you have aspirations to do something on the male side, or were you kind of resolved with the fact that you had, in your mind or in society's mind, you had to stick with the jobs for women?
So my mother gave me a choice about what I was going to do. I could be a nurse or I could be a teacher. Those are the two things. And the reason she chose those jobs, besides that they were women's jobs, was that I could do them until I had my children, because getting married and having children were not a choice. That was not a question. I could do those until my children were in high school, and when they didn't need me anymore every day to be there when they came home from school, then I could go back to teaching or nursing, because there were always a need for teachers or nurses. So because I didn't like blood, I decided to become a teacher. I mean, this is the truth. And I liked it. Teaching was okay, but I didn't love it at all, and it made me want to get married. It made me want to stop teaching and be a stay-at-home mom, even though when I finally did that, I realized that that wasn't going to work either. I never thought that I could do any of the professions that were for men. The only thing I had this burning desire to do was to be a journalist for Time magazine and write op-eds. And although I didn't know this until much later, women were not allowed to write op-eds at the time. Women were researchers and fact-checkers and weren't allowed in any of the newspapers to be a journalist until many years later. So it was a good thing I didn't try to be a journalist, because it wouldn't have worked anyway. At the time, I didn't really fight it because I was so interested in fitting in. I really wanted to fit into where I was supposed to be. And I wanted to be that good Jewish girl, and I wanted to marry that nice Jewish boy, and I wanted to have those children, and I wanted to be Jewish. I loved Judaism. I wanted to be as Jewish as I possibly could. And it didn't occur to me then to even buck tradition. When it first occurred to me was in the mid-'70s, when I heard about the local food cooperative in New Haven wanting to hire a butcher. And specifically, they wanted to hire a woman butcher. And I signed on immediately. I got my resume together, I called them up, I said, "You want to interview me?" And I was hired as one of the first 2 women butchers in the state of Connecticut. It was even before I came out as a lesbian. But the thought of being one of the first women to do anything positive was really exciting to me. And I loved that job. I loved it. It's the only job I ever had that had a beginning, a middle, and an end every single day. That I went to work in the morning and I got to lift 200 pounds of hindquarter and put it on the hook and take my boning knife and cut parts of that off and put it in the trays and seal it up and put it out in the meat case. Someone would buy it, go home, cook the meat, have a great meal, and feel satisfied. It was an incredible job. Plus, I got to wear overalls every day and heavy jackets and work in a 45 to 50 degree environment and cut meat. How could you want to do anything better? So this was the first job I had that was non-traditional. And part of why it was so important for me to do this job is that my grandfather had been a kosher butcher. And I knew that when I became a butcher, my mother would be completely stymied. She lived in Florida, southern Florida, with all the Jews in the condominiums, and she couldn't say, my daughter the butcher. I knew that she would do anything not to say that. My daughter the teacher, my daughter the mother, my daughter the whatever, paralegal, whatever else I'd done, but never my daughter the butcher. And one of the best moments of it was when my parents came to visit me in New Haven, and I took them to the meat room, and I took them to meet my friends, and my mother had this pursed look the whole time. She said, I really wish you wouldn't be doing this. And I said, but why, Mom? And she said, because how can I brag to my friends, my daughter the butcher? I can't say that to them. So it only made me do the job longer, of course, because it really bothered her. So I knew that it was non-traditional, but that's not why I was doing it. I was doing it because I really wanted that experience. And it wasn't until much later, as I tracked the jobs I had and the way I dressed, that I was able to see my own gender identity confusion, probably starting at that point in '75. Certainly when I came out as a lesbian, I thought that was the end of coming out, that I knew that I hadn't been a straight woman, but I still thought that I was a woman. And it really wasn't until about 3 years ago when I understood that I didn't experience myself as a lesbian anymore, but as queer, that saying that I was a lesbian, having it be a female adjective, was too limiting for me. At the time, I didn't understand where that was going, but I knew that it was too limiting and that the word queer was a better word for me to use to describe my sexual orientation. When I came out, I didn't come out traditionally, which is usually you fall in love with someone and you're together and everyone sees you together and they know that you're lesbians. So I came out on July 4th, 1976, at the Alternative People's Bicentennial in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Someone went and bought some pins, and the one that she handed me was a white pin with huge letters, red letters, gay on it. And she assumed that I was already a lesbian, and she handed me the pin and said, do you want one? And in 3 seconds, I had to decide if I was going to take the pin and come out. And I took the pin. So that was how I came out, and it wasn't until months later that I met someone that I wanted to be in a relationship with. But it was important for me to come out that way because it wasn't about a relationship. It was about who I really was at the time. I really was someone who was attracted to women, and I was ready to say that out loud. My last relationship with a woman ended in 2001, and I've been single ever since, and that's really been by choice. And in those years that I've been single, I've had to look at myself without any distractions. And I was able to go to rabbinical school and get my career on track. I also was able to look at who I am, who I've been in the past, who I am in the present, and who I want to be in the future. And it was through that self-examination, and particularly when I moved back from Macon, Georgia, where I was a rabbi in a pulpit for 4 years, that I began to understand that my gender identity wasn't so clear to me. And how I understood that was to look at photos of me starting in 1976, where I'm in a cap and a nice shirt and a tie and dressed in a very male way, even though I still identified as a lesbian and a woman. And there was an arc, there was more of a roller coaster probably, of the clothing that I wore, from skirts and blouses to ties and shirts to, when I was a pulpit rabbi, short skirts and jackets that were the rabbi suits. And I kept looking at these images move from more male to more female to more male to more female, and understanding that where I felt the most comfortable was always in the more male dress. And then I was working for JQ International and doing inclusion trainings, LGBTQ inclusion trainings, and teaching about gender identity, gender expression, biological sex, and sexual orientation, and knowing that what 3 of them were and not knowing what the 4th was. I knew that my sexual orientation was queer. I knew that my biological sex was female, and I knew my sexual orientation was more androgynous to more masculine. And I had to stop and ask myself, what is my gender identity? And it was then that I began to do some writing and thinking about who I was. And I remembered when I was 9 years old, which I believe now was my last genderqueer moment until I understood what that meant, that I, in the morning when I got dressed, consciously didn't put a shirt on and went outside. And I said to my father, who was outside, you know, I'm not wearing a shirt right now, and it's probably the last time that I can do that because I'm going to start getting big. And I, of course, meant that I was going to start getting breasts. And I don't know where that came from. It wasn't anything that was premeditated. But I was really aware in that moment that my body was going to change, and that what I was comfortable being as a 9-year-old, I wasn't going to be comfortable to do that anymore. And it was that memory that got me to think about, what does that mean for me today? And to start stripping away my assumptions about what it meant, what my gender identity was. And the more I stripped away, the more I understood that that doesn't fit me. And as much as I was grateful at the time that I have the body that I have, now my biggest question is, I don't know what to do with my body. What do I do with my body now?
Is there anything that you can share, the feelings that you have about this, that people may relate to?
When I was finally able to identify as genderqueer, the first thing that I felt was enormous relief, because I had tried so hard to fit into the mold of what a woman was supposed to be. And I always looked at other women and thought, I don't look like that. I don't feel internally how she looks externally. And when I realized that I wasn't a woman, what I felt was enormous relief. Because what I feel is an openness to being exactly who I am, and not have to fit into the gender construct of the traits that people think are only woman or only man. That I could fit into whatever was natural for me to do. And I don't have a checklist of how many female traits and how many male traits do I have, because that's irrelevant for anyone, but it's irrelevant for me especially right now. that all I have to do is the next right thing in what feels natural to me. And I think that if I were to say if I were to have anything important to say to people, it would be figure out anything in your life that doesn't fit anymore, that isn't going to work in your life anymore, and change it. And I think that's why I've been able to do the work I've done and impacted the people I have through all of my professions, is because as much as I could in any moment, I work to be exactly who I am and not who I thought I should be. And this has been the biggest one of those, not who I should be. And I don't feel, as some people say, that I'm somewhere in the exact middle between woman and man. I feel like who I am has nothing to do with either. That I am gender queer, meaning none of the above.
How do you define family? And has that changed over the years? Many people struggle with that are queer, and maybe you have some insight you'd like to share.
One of the things I've been thinking a lot about is how LGBTQ people identify family. For most of us, our biological family didn't quite know what to do, especially those of us who are over 40, actually over 35. Our biological families really didn't know what to do with us. And in some way or another, before we came out and after we came out, told us we were doing it wrong. And so we knew that we didn't really fit in as much as we wanted to with our biological families. And we had to create other kinds of families. And my family has changed a lot over the years, from the people that I was with in intimate relationships. Some of it's changed because of my career changes. Some of it's changed because of where I live. Right now, I have a family that includes people who are queer, people who are straight, people who are allies, people who are figuring out how to be allies. And all of them are important in my life, and all of them respect who I am as much as they can. And as I've come out to people more about being genderqueer, I've seen different reactions from people, some whom I would have expected to just embrace my gender identity and who have questioned it or who have not understood it. Mostly people say, okay, or, well, that makes sense to me, or tell me more about it. And those are the kinds of comments I'm always happy to respond to. That the best thing people can say if they don't know what's going on is, tell me more about that. Curiosity is the essential quality that we want in our friends. We want them to be curious about us. And if they are, then we can explain who we are to them, and they can embrace us exactly the way we are. Because too often, people are tolerant of anyone who's different, especially LGBTQ people, and we don't want their tolerance. We want them to embrace us for exactly who we are, and not try to tell us who they think we should be.
If there's any distinctions that you can make for people that have no clue as to what we're talking about today, this would be a good time to touch on those. Definitions that are important to you or that make sense to you about these terms. And the other is, why is it important for binary and conforming people to understand these terms?
One thing that I can say to people who have little or no context to understand about LGBTQ, especially the T, the transgender, is if I had heard about this when I was 25, if I had watched this video, I would have thought that the person I was watching was just making it up. Because there has to be binary. There has to be either a woman or a man. There can't be anything else. And what I would say to people who have that understanding is, be curious. You have your own story of what it means to be a man or to be a woman, and to think about how that affects your life. Not just be curious externally, but be curious internally. So I was born a man. What does that mean to me? I was born a woman. What does that mean to me? How do I make my decisions based on what I understand as my gender identity? And what if I made different decisions? What would that mean about my gender identity and even my sexual orientation? Because there are 4 different ways that we have to understand ourselves. What is the sex that we were born with? What is our biology? And that makes us male or female. What is our true identity? And that makes us either a girl or woman or a man or boy. Who are we attracted to? And that's our sexual orientation. And what are the clothes we're comfortable in? What are the ways we're comfortable in being with people? That's our gender expression. And with understanding that there are 4 separate things and that they're all mix and match. You can be have your biology be female and have your gender identity be male, and have the clothing that you wear be more feminine. All those things are possible. There are no preconceived notions. And I think every time we move away from a preconceived notion, we're more open to see things as they really are, as opposed to see them through the lens that we expect to see them through. You know, in terms of vocabulary, everyone knows that there's female and male. That's clear. There's also masculine and feminine, and between them is androgynous. So how I dress tends to be more androgynous. Many people dress that way. We all know that there are the ends of the spectrum. There's female and there's male. There's the very, very, very most femme woman and the very, very, very most masculine man. So we have to understand that it's a continuum and that there are things in the middle. So in the middle of this continuum are people who are transgender. And transgender is a huge umbrella term for anyone who identifies in a way that's different from their biology. So if you have female biology and your gender identity is as a man, then you're called transgender. Whereas people whose identity fit their biology are called cisgender. And anyone who does not have their biology match their gender identity is transgender. And underneath that big umbrella are other terms. So there's genderqueer, which is how I identify. There's non-binary, meaning not woman, not man. And there's also gender fluid. There are people that feel like some days they feel more like a woman and some days they feel more like a man, and they dress accordingly and they act accordingly. There are people who feel like they're more a woman certain days and they wear dresses those days or skirts. And there are some days that they feel more like a man, and then they end up wearing more male clothing. So those tend to be the underneath the bigger umbrella of transgender.
I'd like to get to some of the milestones in your life, in your career, opportunities that you saw. You saw an opportunity to become a butcher. What other opportunities did you grasp onto and achieve or discard based on things that contributed to your wisdom. I think that's the best way to tie it in, or your insight into gender and gender identity.
I decided to become a psychotherapist when people came to me and asked me to help them. It wasn't anything that I thought about doing, but the more people came to me and said, I never thought about it that way, or, oh, right, that is how I feel and how I'm acting. So I went to therapy school, and at the same time that I became a psychotherapist, my son decided to major in psychology in college. And I said to him, why are you doing that? You don't want to be a therapist. And he said, hell no. He said, I'm doing it to understand my childhood. And I loved that. I loved that wisdom in him. And I thought that's why I became a therapist also, so that I could understand what happened to me and put it into a context of my life at that time. And I became a psychotherapist in 1990 was when I got licensed. But I had been doing counseling for about 10 years before that. And it was from doing that work and hearing people's stories about their lives and understanding the diversity of human experience and how much that affected who people were in the world, that it became clear to me that I needed to know more about myself and more about other people, and I became more and more open to that. That also led me, in the same time and afterwards, to want to reclaim my Jewishness, because I gave up being Jewish when I came out as a lesbian. And I found this synagogue, miraculously, that welcomed LGBTQ people in 1990. And I became very active in it right away. I joined the board and I joined the religious committee, and I became an adult B'nai Mitzvah, because I always wanted to become a bat mitzvah and I didn't in my family. And the more I studied and the more I learned, the more I wanted to do this in my life. And the more people, again, came to me and said, you realize you're becoming a rabbi, right? And I didn't realize that until I found myself sitting on the floor of my local Judaic bookstore, sobbing, reading a book that talked about becoming a rabbi, because it's what I wanted so much. And when I started to say, I can't do this, people started saying to me, of course you can, of course you can. And what I ended up doing was almost unthinkable. In 2000, I sold my home. My partner and I sold our home, and all of our furniture, gave it away or sold it, put a couple of books and CDs in storage, and moved to Jerusalem so I could study to become a rabbi. When I moved to Jerusalem, I knew that my life would never be the same, and I was afraid it wasn't going to work. Here I was, 55 years old, going to rabbinical school, giving up everything that had been stability for me. And I asked my friend if I crashed and burned, if I could come back and stay with her for 6 months. And she said yes. And then I knew that no matter what happened, I had a little bit of a safety net, so I wasn't completely jumping off the cliff, but it felt like that. I chose to study for 2 years in Jerusalem, because if you're going to study Judaism, that's the place to go. And I decided, after studying in the Reform movement and in the conservative movement, that the conservative rabbinical schools were more to my liking. I felt more comfortable. So I applied to Ziegler Rabbinical School in LA and got in and ended up coming to LA and spending 5 years in rabbinical school here. And it was the most exciting education I've had and the very hardest. I was older than every one of my classmates. 2 of them were within 10 years of me, and the rest were within 30 years of me. And I was their mom. I was everyone's mom. And that was fine. I knew how to do that. And they became my teachers when I needed to study for exams. I went to them. And they thought they needed me, but they really didn't need me. I needed them. There are some people that I could name that I would not have gotten ordained without them. Teachers and students who helped me, who tutored me. I came to school, I did a poll in rabbinical school of why people became rabbis. And every one of them said, because I had a really strong Jewish education, I was in youth group, my grandparents were Holocaust survivors, and there was one other. And my family were rabbis. Those were the 4 things people said. I had none of those. I didn't have a Jewish education. No one in my family was a Holocaust survivor. There was nothing in my life that led me to becoming a rabbi that had any experience except my own desire. So I came to rabbinical school at 55 with no background. And they all had everything that I didn't have. So it was really like crawling over cut glass to get through rabbinical school. Every class I took, except for practical rabbinics, or pastoral counseling, whatever it was called, because I knew how to do that. They still made me take the class, believe it or not, as a licensed marriage family therapist, but I took the class, I aced it. It was really easy, thank God. Everything else I struggled for. And I did get A's and B's, really proud to say, but every one of those was hard-earned. And as hard as it was, I can tell you that the most amazing evening of my life was when I got ordained. And we voted, each class votes, who they want to do the ordination sermon to get up in front of between 500 and 1,000 people and be the one to speak for the whole class. And they chose me to do that. So I stood up in front of every leader of the conservative movement, all the families, all the friends, the president of the congregation I was going to, my son, who was so proud of me, and give this sermon about community and about how important Jewish community was and what that meant to us as a class and what that meant to all of us as we went off on our jobs. And I had this talit put on my shoulders. My mentor from my pulpit, my student pulpit, came up and presented me to the dean of the rabbinical school. I was standing with my ordination class up on the stage, receiving our ordination from the Beit Din, from the 3 rabbis who created the court that was ordaining us. And we're told that we were now the newest rabbis in Israel. And it was the most amazing moment of my life to know that I went from this child who didn't have any choice about who she could be to being a rabbi in Israel. That was what I wanted more than anything. And I knew in that moment that even though my mother gave me 2 choices, none of which were rabbi, that had she been alive and been there, that she would have been so proud and she would have understood that her rigidity was wrong and that she would have felt like I had proved who I really could be and that she could see that now. When I was in rabbinical school and thought about my rabbinate, I pictured a congregation. I thought that's what I would do. I would preach and I would teach to a congregation. And when that really wasn't what was suited to me, I had much too big a mouth. I had way too many opinions to fit into any congregation. So when I came back to LA, I looked for something that I wanted to do, and pretty much exactly 5 years ago, I met Asher Gellis, who was the executive director of JQ, and I knew in that moment that that's the organization I wanted to volunteer for. It never occurred to me that I could be a rabbi, a psychotherapist, and queer, and get paid to do all of those things. But when I told Asher that I wanted to volunteer, and then told him what my background was, the first thing he said was helpline. And without even knowing what he meant, I said yes, because I knew that that was perfect, that I was going to work for this organization. I could be a psychotherapist, I could be a rabbi with all the wisdom that I've gained, and I could also be queer out loud and never have to hide who I am. And I started off as a volunteer for the organization, and synchronicity was that we went and talked with the Federation a few months after I started volunteering, and they were very excited to fund the JQ helpline, and they gave us seed funding. So 9 months after I started to volunteer, I had a job. I got paid. And I got to create the service end of JQ and expand it beyond what anyone would have thought would have happened at that time. And I take telephone calls from people all over the world, not just the US, but all over the world. I am able to give them resources where they are. I go out and do inclusion trainings. We have a speakers bureau that I, along with 2 other people, trained. We have 17 trained speakers to go out into the world and talk about who we are and what it means to be queer, and to give our personal experiences of what it means to be out as both gender queer and transgender and our different sexual orientations than just straight. This is such an important time because we have come so far from where we were, and yet we're going back now. We're seeing so many of our successes be taken away from us. And this is a moment that we can't stop working to make this better. We have to understand that we will ultimately win. There isn't possibility of losing because we've had too much of a taste of what it feels like to be accepted. When I decided to go to Ziegler Rabbinical School, I knew that they didn't allow people to be openly gay or lesbian there. And bisexual, transgender weren't even part of the understanding. So I also was told by many people, many rabbis, that within a year and a half at the most, that the law was going to change, and the conservative movement would then welcome lesbian and gays to become rabbis. And it did change, but it took 4.5 years. So I spent 4.5 years in rabbinical school in the closet, listening to people say things like, well, don't we want our rabbis to be normal? That's why we don't have lesbian and gay rabbis. Or they would say, well, no one who's gay or lesbian would want to be a conservative rabbi because they wouldn't be able to fulfill the Jewish law, right? And every time I heard one of those comments by these ignorant people who were leaders of Jewish seminaries, a little piece of me would die because I would think, they're talking about me, and I know I'm going to be an amazing rabbi. And I know that because of the life that I've lived, that people can relate to me. And it wasn't until mid-December 2006 that the law changed. And then I got to be completely out. And I'm the first student to get ordained by the conservative movement who got ordained out. There were many, many other people who were in the closet when they were ordained. Well, maybe not many, many. There were some other people who were out when they got ordained, but I was the first one that could go on interviews and be completely honest about who I am. And what happened before to the people who couldn't be out, that the congregations were all angry. They felt betrayed because they didn't know this really important thing about their new rabbi's life. And it was such a setup for us to fail, those of us who were queer and went to rabbinical school, because we couldn't be who we really were until we got to our pulpit. So, when I came back to LA, I didn't have any queer friends. Everyone I knew I had known from rabbinical school, so it was all of the teachers, because the students, of course, were gone. It was all the teachers, and all of them were straight. And one of my friends who was bi said to me, "You gotta meet some queers. You've gotta meet some queers." And I said, "Okay, find me some." And she did. There was an evening of a workshop on self-care, and it was being presented by JQ International, which I had never heard of, but the very short description said that it was an LGBTQ and Jewish organization. So I went to where it was being held, which was at Asher Gellis's house. And for those of you who have been to Asher's house, you know that it's on the third steepest street in Los Angeles. And I literally had to hold on as I walked from my car down the street to Asher's house. But I want to tell you it was worth it, because what I found when I got in there was not only a great workshop on self-care, but I also met Asher Gellis, who is still the director of JQ International. And JQ works to build and nurture a healthy fusion of LGBTQ and Jewish identities. And now it's we do this by creating programming that is both Jewish and LGBTQ, by doing educational programs. We specifically have a JQSA, Jewish Queer Straight Alliance, for teens 13 to 18, teens who are queer and allies, who do programs once a month. And we do it through our services, through the JQ Helpline, through inclusion trainings, and through the Speakers Bureau. And I receive calls and emails every day from LGBTQ people, from allies, from parents, from teachers, from people that aren't LGBTQ, people that aren't Jewish, and everyone who calls, I help them in whatever ways I can. And we get calls from people who are homeless and on the street, who've just been thrown out of their parents' homes, who are suicidal, people who are involved in a domestic violent relationship, people who are looking for a husband, people who are looking for a synagogue or a Jewish day school, all of them. And I find resources for them, and I give them the support that I can.